Welcome to the second class sponsored by the Sicilia DOC, Denominazione di Origine Controllata. So last time we talked about Sicilia, Sicily, where it is. We talked about the terroir of the area. We discussed how very essential this area is. I will pull up my nerdy map again, and we can look at this. But basically, what we had was, an island in the middle of the Mediterranean. It is south, or kind of the boot is kicking this triangular island, the largest in the entire Mediterranean. And it is at really the crossroads of Europe. It is near the Middle East. It is near also Africa. It's not too far away from Tunisia. And it is a very, very essential island and has been over the course of history, which is why we are really going to cover the history. In order to understand Sicily, I think there's two things you really need. One is to understand the entire landscape of what it looks like or what it is, right? The island itself. And then the other thing is the people and the culture and time, the time that has passed and how it became what it is and how that affects the wine. So the other thing to notice, besides the fact that it is a triangle, is that this island is very hilly. It is the largest hillside wine region in Italy. And it also is the most, it has the most mountain viticulture next to Trentino Alto Adige. So that's kind of a surprising thing, I think, and also pretty amazing. If we look at the history of Sicily, I talked about this in the podcast, and this is going to be, some repeat of that, but we're going to taste wine. I didn't include the legend of how the Greeks believe that it came about, the island itself, and why it's a triangle. And that is the story of the nymphs. Look at this pretty picture, right? So it is called the Trinacria, which is the kind of the triangle. And there's a myth that says that there were three nymphs, and these nymphs decided that they were going to capture all of the beauty around the world, of every place around the world. And they went on a journey to seek out the most beautiful places they could possibly find. And they gathered all the stones and the fruits and the dirt, and then they were flying back over this ocean, the Mediterranean, and they were like, wow, that's really gorgeous. They couldn't stop looking at it. They flew down, each of them landed in, kind of a triangular format, and they put down all the stuff that they had gathered. The dirt filled itself in magically, of course, because they're nymphs, and this is a myth, and it joined together in a triangular formation. And that is why Sicily is this perfect triangle. But really, if we take that one step further, we know Italy is, Sicily rather, is a triangular shape. And really the most important thing about it is that it is in such a strategic location that it's an awesome place to conquer if you're happen to be floating around and going along the Mediterranean. The Sicilia DOC represents the entire island. So the reason that I'm talking about the entire island is because the history of the island and the culture of the island really is represented by the Sicilia DOC. It's 58,000 hectares or 58,000 acres or 23,000 hectares. It's about 25% of the acreage or hectarage that's available in Sicily. So it does cover a lot of area, 7,600 wine growers, 504 bottlers. Just so you know, if we were talking about that in Sonoma, it would be much more at parity. So lots more growers than people bottling their own wine, 90.6 million bottles of wine a year. So they make a decent amount, fourth most prolific producer in Italy. So in terms of the provinces. And Sicilia DOC was set up to really protect the brand Sicilia, to make sure that when you saw it, as I said on the podcast this week, if MCIs can look at the bottle and know that it's from Sicily when it's in the section, then we're doing pretty well, right? We're doing okay. So, and there's a bunch of different areas that are allowed in the Sicilia DOC, Vittoria, Menfi, Noto. So lots of that stuff. You can watch it. If you missed the last installment, you can watch it on the YouTube channel. The other thing to notice is that we talked about this with Alberto Tasca de Almarita. And really, when we talk about the conquering people, the legacy of food, who crossed over, the people who crossed over this triangle over tens of thousands, 10,000 years, really, it's what built the culture. And because of that, I think actually rather than me talk about it, we are going to hear from Alberto because he and I talked about this.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to invite me. The culture of Sicily, to talk about culture of Sicily, we need a lot of time. I mean, it's a crazy culture. Sicily is, we have to start where is Sicily. Sicily in the heart of the Mediterranean Sea. It's the big island of the Mediterranean Sea, and it's a really strategic logistic place. And for that reason, we had many population that arrived in Sicily and to stay in Sicily for decades or centuries and bring in their own culture there. So if you go around Sicily, town by town, city by city, you find different architectural historical testimonies or even kind of food or language. You can find different dialects inside Sicily. So, and all this kind of diversity, I think, influence a lot in terms of food and wine in general. So it's a treasure of diversity.
Why do you think that people love the culture so much of Sicily? They love to visit. They love the people, they love the warmth. What is it about the Sicilian culture? And really, it does trickle over into the wine culture that makes it so different from even other parts of Italy. Maybe in the north, it's a little bit different. The culture is different. Why is it that we just love it so much? What is it about the people of Sicily? And you're smiling because I know you know it's true.
No, there is a lot of different answer to this question because, I mean, it's complex. Sicily is really simple, and Sicilian people are really simple when you meet them, open, you feel home every time. You feel comfortable because there is a lot of authenticity there. And so people love to be who they are. And it is really transversal. So it doesn't matter, it's not matter if you are a king or you are, I mean, the last person that make I mean, whatever you made, it doesn't matter. It's depend on who you are and how you are and how you can interact with people. So there is not hypocrisy, it's really direct, it's really authentic even in this way. And there's a lot of different cultures. So if you think about the history and how many population arrive here to live in Sicily, and I think there is a stratification of different culture. All this stratification means different seeds that in all of us, and that means a lot of openness to diversity, and even different details that can let us understand how you smile, why you smile in this way, or you act and things. So it's a culture that is really simple, at the same time really rich of diversity.
And authentic. Authenticity, right? Being who you are.
Yes, it's really there. You can touch it everywhere. And it's like food and like the wines.
As we talk about the history of Sicily, we're going to taste through these wines and go through what the history is and really how the culture is influenced here. So Sicily is a place that was inhabited 10,000 years ago. It has been continuously populated basically since it started. And we have 3 tribes that started here, not the nymphs. I mean, although they probably built it. We had the Sicani, who were probably from Spain. There's a very strong linkage between Sicily and Spain. We'll talk about that. The extreme west had the Elimi. The Elimi were really important because they were the ones that made wine. This is prehistory, and people were making wine here. So again, they came from the cradle of civilization, the basin, and they brought winemaking techniques here. So that is incredibly important because we have always seen wine being made in Sicily. We also have the Siculi tribe. They came later, and the island is actually named after them. If we look at the Greeks, and I have some pretty pictures for you, of course, you know, the path along of the Greeks, we've got Sicily, you know, being a major point, a stopping point as you look at, you know, moving from Greece, also from Phoenicia, which is basically today's Lebanon. And apparently Dionysus planted the first vineyards. I love these Greek myths. I think they're hilarious. So like, you know, Dionysus had a really hard journey across the Mediterranean and planted a vine in the middle of Sicily. And it turned out that that was the first vine, and it's doing really, it did really great in Naxos on the coast. So that is northeast of the Etna. And we have here the Greeks really bringing excellent viticulture all over, especially over here, if you can see on this map, to the eastern coast. So the island had a fantastic history of Greeks doing viticulture here. Syracusa on the south coast, 734 BC, it was founded, and the food culture. I mean, it cannot be underestimated, the food culture. So you have, you've got them bringing vineyards and olives, and you have pomegranates and figs and wheat, walnuts, hazelnuts, all of that was brought. So that stuff is still there today, and that was all brought by the Greeks. Not only did they bring that, they also brought varietal selection. They brought picking the best of the best, what was there, pruning, understanding, you know, dry farming, things like that. So using the alberello method, that little tree method, which really helps in times of, you know, when there's a lot of wind and there's a lot of heat, that can really help keep the vines alive. So the Greeks not only were responsible for, you know, bringing a lot of culture and taking over Sicily, but also for bringing all of these new innovations in viticulture, which improved the wine, allowed them to make more wine. And they also brought grapes. Okay, so they brought likely Zibibo, which we have on our table, Catarratto, which is now called Lucido, Insolia, which is Ansonica in Tuscany. I'll tell you about that later. Grecanico, which is actually Garganega, which is made in Suave. And all of that stuff was widely planted. So, and we don't even know what else they brought, but they brought these grapes from the motherland and planted them in Sicily, and we are still growing them today there, right? So legacy of food and wine, the idea that it was important, that it was not just some sort of, you know, thing to get you drunk, or it was not some sort of fun product that maybe we look at it like today. It was a really important part of their culture and their life in ancient Greece. It was also the legacy, right? So the idea that it was integrated into the economics, into the food, everything was coming together. So that is something that even exists today, and that is from the Greeks. Let's look at our very first wine. And we mentioned Lucido, so we might as well have the Lucido and talk about the Lucido. So the Lucido grape, let me pull up what it looks like here. We have, sorry, these are the ancient grapes, Grecanico, Insolia, Zibibo, and Catarratto Bianco, which we are going to talk about right now. So this is Lucido. You'll see it being called Lucido or Catarratto. They decided to change the name in 2018 because they found that it was a little bit difficult to say the name if you are not Italian. And Lucido, even if a lot of us are going to pronounce it in the Spanish way and say Lucido, it's still easier to say than Catarratto. So you can use either on the bottle, and you will see either on the bottle, but Catarratto has been, or Lucido has been cultivated here since ancient times. The parent it's likely the parent of Garganega or Grecanico, and it is considered one of Italy's oldest, or Sicily's oldest grapes. It is the most widely planted of all of the grapes, and that is because it used to be the main grape for Marsala, which was the big wine of the island. Today, it still covers a third of all vineyards on the island. So what you have here is a grape that is incredibly well represented. It's always really strange. We always think of warmer places of, oh, well, of course it's a red wine dominant, not in Sicily. And that's partially because of that Marsala tradition. And that is made out of white grapes, Catarratto or Lucido being the main one. So it used to be 75% of planting. So again, even though it's a third and that's a lot, it's not as much as it was. It is grown in Trapani and Palermo. It's grown on the east. It's grown in Etna as a blending grape with Caricante for Etna Bianco. It is everywhere. So this grape is very well represented. We know that it was first cited in 1516. The interesting thing is it's not exactly one grape. It's actually like a family of grapes, sort of like Lambrusco. If you listen to the Lambrusco podcast, you'll hear me talk about, like, it's not one grape, it's a bunch of grapes that are all called Lambrusco. Catarratto, which is the formal kind of name that the Italian government gives this grape, it falls under a number of different biotypes, as they call it, phenotypes, whatever, clones, whatever you want to call it. So they already recognized that by the 1600s or the 1700s. By 1880s, they were talking about it again. And then in the 1970s, they decided that they were actually two different grapes. And now we've kind of come back around and said, well, no, actually it's one grape. So in any case, there are some different characteristics that you can get in Catarratto or Lucido as a result, because there's two cultivars. You have Catarratto Bianco Comune, the common white Catarratto. So this is really the most important Sicilian grape. It is what they used in Marsala, and it is incredibly aromatic. It has a lot of spice. It has a lot of aroma, a very long finish, really, really great for a fortified wine. And then there is the Lucido clone, which is where we're getting this from, or the Lucido biotype, phenotype, whatever. And it's actually, Lucido is like glossy white. And the reason is because there's something that's called the bloom on top of the grapevine. So if they turn kind of whitish, that's bloom, they call that the bloom. There's no bloom on the Lucido variety. So they call it Lucido or glossy, clear, light, whatever. So this wine, this type tends to be more herbaceous. It tends to be a little bit more alcoholic, have a little bit more bitterness on the finish. In the vineyard, though, this grape, Lucido, is great because it is pretty resistant to disease. It's moderately vigorous, but not too vigorous. So it's not a real trouble in the vineyard to take care of it. And it is pretty good in acidity, which is important. Again, you don't want to bake out the acidity in a grape in a hot climate. And it does very well on hillsides. And since we have a lot of hillsides to grow stuff on, Catarratto or Lucido does very well there. The effort here to get the best cultivars as we're making wines that are no longer Marsala, but are dry whites or skin contact wines. There are a ton of skin contact wines or orange wines. And as we are seeing more people caring about like the quality of Catarratto, it's very, very interesting to see. Also, because it can be a little bit neutral in flavor, winemaking does take a big role here. So you see surly aging on the lees, some skin contact, even if they're not calling it orange wine, just to give the wine a little bit more oomph, a little more flavor, since those skins have some flavor. Now, orange wine's going to go all the way. It's going to be tannic. It's going to have more, nut, fennel, even like iron ore type flavors. That's going to be very different from these lighter wines, which are medium to full body. So let's taste it. It's a nice light color, right? So really kind of a pale color, a little bit of yellow highlights. And if you have a natural one, it might be a little cloudy, but give it a swirl around the glass and take a sniff. So lovely, a little bit of orange, lemon zest, things like that. What do you guys have? Feel free to drop your comments in the chat if you would like. So, grapefruit, a little bit of salinity, right? So a lot of Sicilian wines show that salinity, the island wines. We see that in a lot of different places along the coast that grow grapes. Take a sip. Nice body, very fresh. Would be so good with seafood. I wish I had some seafood. I know some of you guys cooked up. You told me what you're cooking. So really nice. Shannon got some ripe peach. Alicia got citrus and mineral. I get that too. Yep. And effervescence, Renee, not unless they do make lucido in a sparkling type, but if it's effervescent, it depends on how effervescent it is. It could have just been bottled with a little CO2. It could have been still fermenting, any of that. Really, really nice. Green olive from Deborah, mild. Yeah, it's a nice fresh wine. It is a nice summer sipper, and it goes very well with food. So if you do happen to have some cheeses, that would be a nice thing to try this with, because it does just complement it. It is a mild wine. It is very important for us to have a handle on what it tastes like, because it is such a big, major player here. My wine is something that's had a little lees contact, some dead yeast cells. So it's broken up. So it's a little bit richer than if the wine was just fermented in a kind of regular way. So rich like a Chardonnay from Julia. And I think that that's very interesting, because a lot of people do say that when it is made in a certain style, meaning with malolactic fermentation, with surly aging, with bottanage, which means stirring those dead yeast cells up, when you can even put it in oak, most people don't. When you do all that and a little skin contact, you get something more like a Chardonnay. And that makes a lot of sense, because this grape tends to be a little bit more neutral in flavor, as sometimes Chardonnay can be when growing in especially in hot places. So that makes sense. A lot of people say that it's more like Chardonnay. So Heather's saying hers is more like Sauvignon Blanc, and mine is just sort of like its own self. So John is saying that his is really nice, creamy, nice with Gruyere. Absolutely. How do you know if your wine has surly aging? Michael and Gina, I looked it up on the producer website. That's how. So that's always a good tip, is to make sure that, you can, the producers often, especially in a place like Sicily, they do a really good job of posting the winemaker notes, and they'll tell you what there is. Bitterness on the finish from Frank, and that's absolutely typical. So some of that typicity, that bitterness on the finish. All right, so let's move on, and we're going to talk about the Romans. We've got 3 wines to taste. So as we look at the Romans, and I just want you to know that this picture of Caesar, of course, this thing is completely authentic. I did not do anything to this picture. So, the Romans came in the 2nd century. We had them really conquering everything. This is a picture of the Roman Empire. Was there anything that they did not own along the Mediterranean basin? No, they had everything. And of course, Rome was the center of it all. So they conquered Sicily from Greece, and it was actually the first province outside of the peninsula that they controlled. And then, of course, they spread from there. It was very important for grain. So we see this old Roman aqueduct here on Sicily. This is a picture from Sicily, old Roman aqueduct near grain fields. This became the granary for the entire empire, the entire Roman Empire. So again, we see that tie to pasta and bread, and the idea that these are things that can grow quite well here, and you can make products out of them that people will enjoy, that tie to food. Sicily was looked on as an agricultural center in ancient Rome, and of course, as a center for making a lot of wine, and high quality wine. Grapes out of this region, out of Sicily, made Mamertino, which was Julius Caesar's favorite wine, likely made from, it could have been made from Nocero or Nero d'Avola if he liked the red. If it was the white, it could have been Caracante and Catarratto or Lucido. It could have been anything. So we're not 100% sure. There is a Mamertino DOC now that sort of honors that tradition. But the most important thing is these wines were beloved. They were well known, and they were an economic commodity. They were exported everywhere. Remember that, I talk about Romans all the time. I talk about monks all the time. Remember this. There was no winemaking in the Rhone, in Burgundy, in Bordeaux. None of this existed until the Romans made it happen. And before they made it happen, they did not allow viticulture in the areas that they conquered. So they were shipping wine from their areas, from Rome and from the areas that they owned in what present day Italy, up to what is Gaul and what was Swabia. And now we see all of these things from Sicily, these artifacts that have turned up that prove that wine was shipped up there. So again, this is really the cradle of civilization for winemaking. Not only that, if we go back to the map here, this is a really very interesting thing in the tie with food again. This was Asia. Asia Minor is Cappadocia, and like all this area is Turkey. That was kind of Asia Minor, which they also owned. And in the eastern part of the empire, they brought back things like cherries and figs and all of the spices, cinnamon and things like that. So we see that popping up today in the cuisine of Sicilia because all of those things were accessible. All this trade happened along the Mediterranean. And as a result, Sicily really benefited from a food and wine perspective. So really a very important fact. The Byzantines also were here, and they, after the Romans, things fell apart for the Romans, and then it didn't go very well. So the Byzantines were, if you've ever been into a Byzantine church, they are unbelievable. I highly recommend it. They're absolutely gorgeous, like the level of detail. But remember, it is a church. What happens when there's a church? This is part and parcel of the Catholic tradition, or the even Eastern Orthodox tradition. Wine was acceptable. Wine was accepted. Wine was embraced. And so the Byzantines kept that tradition going. It was something that was important to them. After that, we had the Arab rule. And Arab rule brought some challenges because according to the law in the Muslim tradition or Muslim religion, you are not allowed to drink alcohol. That's against the law. And so now we have a problem for viticulture, right? The rest of the food was great. They brought a lot of food. So they mostly did not allow alcohol. They let some things slide. Things were allowed, but that's why we still have these grapes, right? They allowed some things to slide. There was this religious ban on consumption, but there was one grape that was pretty acceptable to them because it was a triple threat. It was a grape that was and this doesn't happen that much with Vitis vinifera, right? It doesn't happen that you're going to have a grape that you can have as a table grape. You can dry it as a raisin and it'll taste good, and you can make it into wine. There's only really a very, I don't even know what you would have that could do all of those things. And because of that, Zibibo or Zibib, which got its name from the Muslim rule, was able to survive, not only survive, but thrive. And there were little taverns that actually sold Zibibo wine. Muscat Alexandria is Zibibo. Okay, so that is the same grape. And, there's Muscat grown all over the world. So Muscat Alexandria is a member of the Muscat family, which is one of the oldest genetically modified vines that is still in existence. It is almost in every single wine growing area in the world. Everybody grows Muscat. Maybe it was cultivated in ancient Egypt, especially near Alexandria, and that is why it's called Muscat Alexandria. And it was developed through trade contacts. However, there is an argument. Ian DeGatta, who is kind of the foremost authority on Italian grapes, who writes in English, said that, really Zibibo, the name Zibibo was used before the name Muscat Alexandria. And as a result of that, maybe Zibibo was native to Sicily. We don't really know, okay? So some believe that it was native, some don't, but likely it was brought from Egypt, from Alexandria, down into this area. Anyway, it wound up really being successful. It has many names. It's referred to as Moscato di Alessandria, Moscato di Pantalaria, which I will talk about in a second, Moscateloni. It is mostly grown in the province of Trapani, but also in the special island of Pantalaria, which I will talk about. Like I said, it made traditionally only sweet aromatic wines that were dried on straw mats. They were straw wines. Today, they make every kind of wine, really. Zibibo is later ripening. It does tend to have big bunches, way bigger than the traditional Muscat that we see in France, which is Muscat Blanc à Petit Grain. That is the wine that you see in Alsace for making that dry Muscat there. You see it for Vendu Naturel in the south of France, in the Languedoc, also in Baume de Venise. You will see all of that being made out of Muscat Blanc à Petit Cran. Now, it is related to Muscat of Alexandria, but it is a different grape, or Zibibo, it is a different grape. This, again, so well suited. This could be like the grape of the future, so well suited to Sicily, because you have sensitivity to humidity, which you do not have in Sicily. So you have no humidity. That's kind of its only problem. And the rest is, it does really well in heat. It does really well in sun. It is incredibly drought resistant. It is wind tolerant. It does really well in these seaside conditions. It gathers salinity. It is grown all over the Mediterranean, even in hot areas like Egypt. There are two types also. There's some looser bunches that have higher alcohol and a little bit lower acidity, and those are very aromatic. You have more compact bunches. Those are a little tougher. They tend, anything that has a compact bunch, you can get rot on it very easily. So that's a little challenging, but they do tend to have higher acidity. The only problem is they're a little thinner. Zibibo can be made in so many different styles. They are also doing orange wine out of Zibibo, the skin contact wine, often in amphora, a nod to the past. Dry wines, still and sparkling, are made from Zibibo. You have sweet wines. They're either left on the vine to raisin out a little bit, that late harvest idea, or they dry them on straw nuts, a part of the straw wine family, like not so different from Amarone. And they have to use yeast strains. They have to be very careful, because they must use yeast strains that are going to help Zibibo, and you're going to see why in a second, express its best self. Its best self. And I mean, I'm really pulling out, like, I mean, you guys have to do your podcast homework, I think. So in here, we have the aromas that we talked about in the first podcast of the year this year, the wine aromas. So these are terpenes, and that is what Zibibo is really strong in. So if you pick up your Zibibo and swirl it around the glass and smell it, you will see, okay, linalool, which is lavender and floral and basil, right? You can smell that in there. Bergamot, that Earl Grey tea, I get a lot of that coming off of this wine. The geraniol, which is that sweet rose scent, right? So citronella also, and then you have lemongrass coming from the nerol. So these are all in this glass. So let's taste our wine, and you can, definitely drop your comments. But I think the most significant thing about Zibibo is how strong it is in aromatics. It should be powerful. It should be in that family of Viognier, and it should be like, Torrontés. It should be very, very strong, right? So let's taste the wine. So it seems like it's going to be sweet, but mine is bone dry, very dry, but so flavorful, so rich. That is why the recommendation that I have is to have it with some stronger cheeses. It can handle it. It will take on blue cheese. It can take that on. It can take on, a strongly flavored salmon. It can take on things like that. If in its sweet incarnation, it will take on cannoli and some of the traditional desserts, things that are filled with almond paste, which are pretty typical here. Let me see what you all are saying. Minty. I like that, Stuart. That's kind of cool. So yes, that can be there too, right? That lemongrass note can translate to mint. Yeah, really nice ginger. That's really a nice expression of the grape as well. Can you compare it to Catarratto? Clarissa asked. So Catarratto tends to be, or Lucido tends to be a little bit more neutral. Zibibo, if you've ever had a Viognier before, Clarissa, that is what we're tasting, or something like a Torrontés. It has a ton of floral aromatics, all of those aromas that we're tasting. So those really strong lemongrass or basil, you have a lot of rose, you have a lot of floral aromatics, all of that is going to be in the glass, and it's dry. So it's a bit misleading, because you think, oh, it smells so sweet, it's going to be sweet, but then it's dry. So very different from the Lucido, which tends to be a bit more neutral, or it can be more like Chardonnay if it's got some winemaking tricks on it up its sleeve, but it is a very powerful aroma for sure. All right, so it looks like some people love it, some people hate it, right? Gewürztraminer would be another one. I think Gewürztraminer has, I almost think Gewürztraminer has a little bit of that more warm smell. I know that's such an odd thing to say, but it's sort of like more warm spice, or, you know, those lychee flavors. And then this tends to be more lemongrass to me, a little bit more of that minty lemongrass thing. So Alicia, great with honey goat cheese. Oh, I'm gonna have to get some of that. That sounds delicious. Really great acidity too, right? Interesting that it doesn't seem like it would have acidity, but it absolutely does. So that is Zibibo. The one thing I do want to say is, Abraham brought this up. This is not within the Sicilia DOC. Pantalaria is right over here. It is an island, and look at these unbelievable terraced vineyards. It is in the Mediterranean. It's a volcanic island. It is between Sicily and Tunisia, and it experiences a very hot, windy climate. So as a result of that, it is not only is it isolated, it is incredibly difficult to grow grapes here. And people that do it, it really has to be a labor of love. And they put some of them in like little nests, like they do in Santorini in Greece or in the Canary Islands. The wines are almost exclusively made out of Zibibo. Some are dry, most are sweet, and they have this kind of orange marmalade flavor to them. And they also make spumante, they make frizzante, which is a little bit less than full sparkling. Spumante is fully sparkling. And then they make these passito wines, which are straw wines. They're dried out on straw mats. They have ones that are incredibly sweet, ones that are a little bit less sweet. But these wines are actually this area. The reason I mention it is that even though it's not part of the Sicilia DOC, it is a really important part of the Zibibo tradition, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the difficulty and for viticulture, because it is such an old tradition and it's pretty amazing. So let's move on to our next piece of history here, and we'll get to the Normans, Swabians, French, and Spanish. So the Normans came in, Christian descendants of the Vikings. They formed the Kingdom of Sicily. They conquered Sicily. They brought it back. I mean, look how badass that guy looks, right? Like that's Roger, the conqueror here. And so they expanded vineyards, again, seeing it as a huge economic opportunity. They traded Sicilian wine more for the reputation here. The Norman rule ended. We had the Swabians, the Germans, right? They were interested in the agriculture in this area. They did not have the salubrious climate up in Bavaria that they were able to have down here. So they conquered. Didn't last for that long, about 77 years here. And then we had the Pope Clement, installing the Count of Anjou from France. That really did not go well because unfortunately a French soldier insulted a Sicilian woman on her way to Vesper service, and that was basically an all-out rebellion. So that, like I said, did not go very well. And so Charles got booted out, but we still have some German, French, and, you know, Northern European influence here. And then we have Spain. Now, the Spanish, the Aragon, right? The Kingdom of Aragon wound up ruling this area and taking control for so very long. The Aragon is near Barcelona and a little bit farther inland. And this was so very important to the formation of today's culture in Sicily. For a very long, if you think about where Sicily is versus Spain, it's a little bit hard to do communication in like the 1200s, like 1300s. So the kings were related to all of the people, the kings of Sicily were related to everybody in Spain, and they trusted them to just kind of do their own thing. So it was kind of autonomous, but it was still part of Spain. The royal court spoke Catalan and they spoke Aragonese, but the regular people spoke Sicilian. So it was really, this is the formation, the gelling of the entire area, right? So in the 14th century, Sicily is kind of independent. We see wine guilds forming. We see merchants organizing. We see vignerons organizing, guilds forming to share information, also to sort of organize trade better. So again, the economics, the idea that it's so tied into what people did, this was a job, right? This was part of their economy. The wines also, they recognized, the Spanish recognized, or the Aragonese recognized that the wines were a little bit higher in alcohol. They actually got ripe. And there were some people up north who had some problems with that. So they shipped the wines up north and made lots of money that way too, beefing up wines from places like Piedmont and Tuscany and other parts of Europe to make some money, which they did, right? So production was thriving all over the place. And this was a huge moment. The biggest moment, I wish I could play the clip. I had a clip queued up for Alberto, but the sound doesn't work. I'm not going to frustrate everybody by trying to play it again. But the thing about it is that there was a pivotal moment under the Spanish rule, or the Aragonese rule, which is that at the time in the 1600s, 1700s, we had the age of exploration and the time of the colonies, right? 1500s forward. And the Spanish, you probably are aware, were a little prolific on their colonization, especially of Latin America and of North America, Central America. And they discovered a whole bunch of new and awesome foods that they brought back to Spain and any of the kind of satellite areas that they ruled. This is when the tomato made it to Sicily. The tomato, squash, peppers, cactus, chocolate. There's still a town in sort of the southeastern portion that makes chocolate in this ancient way from Mexican chocolate. Okay, so this tradition, this pivotal moment, could not have happened without Spanish rule. When you think about the influence and how that, just that, by chance that happened, we would not have the kind of Southern Italian or Italian cuisine as we know it if that tomato had not come into the lives of Sicilians. So it is really quite remarkable, right? It's one thing that made an enormous difference in the history of food for all of Sicily and really the culture of food for all of Italy. Imagine a world where you couldn't eat with the wine that you made. Could you possibly imagine that?
No, yeah, there are many places around the world with the same, totally different tastes.
I'm talking about your world, though. Talk about the importance of food in Sicilian culture and why, when you're making the wines, you think about food, right? Do you try wines without food, really? Or is it just it's such a central part of the culture of Sicily?
Yes, it's more with food. We used to drink wine when we are sitting at table and then things. We love wine with aperitif, but even as an aperitif, we have a bit of food with wines. And so the things that I think is authenticity, because nature here is really generous. So the other thing is, if you touch too much of food, what kind of food, people say, why? Why you are changing what nature give us? Because it's a natural really tasting, and so that we love it. The other things is that it's really important to know that in Sicily we have seasonal food, so we never had to store food for winter or for summer. So each season give us different food, and so it's always difference. And then the pairing with wines change because of the seasons, and this is another great things. The other important things is that the culture between town and town. So the arancina that you find in Palermo is different from the one that you find in Catania. In Catania they call arancino, here we call arancina, and we are really proud. And their tasting is different, but come from the same culture, Arabs culture and things. Or cheese or whatever. Each town has its own tradition, and we are still keeping that.
Since we're in the 1600s, let's do our last wine, Frappato. Frappato is grown mainly in the provinces of Siracusa, Ragusa. It's around Vittoria, Trapani. It is in sort of the southeast corner. It's the basis with Nero d'Avola of one of the only DOCG in Sicily, Ceresuolo di Vittoria. And it is not very widely planted. Relatively speaking, it's 17th, okay? 17th in planting. So we have our most planted grape, and then we have 17th for Frappato. It's really more recent that it's been made as a standalone grape as people have been demanding kind of lighter style wines, less heavy wines. Frappato has all of that stuff going for it. We don't know the origins of it, really. We think it probably is from around Victoria. It was probably something that was domesticated, but we also do think that it's probably related to the Nerelli family, Nerello Mascalese. Again, I'm going to talk about all these grapes later. Nerello Mascalese, Nerello Cappuccio, Caricante in the east, and then also Pericone. I'll talk about that also in the west. So it also bears some genetic resemblance to Sangiovese, probably related to that. So Frappato is a really interesting grape, and we're really starting to see people making more of it as a standalone variety. And I will tell you, I tasted some yesterday and it just blew me away. And I was with somebody who was very skeptical about it, and it was delicious. I mean, this wine is like an exciting, exciting wine. We also don't even know where the name comes from. It could come from the word fruity. It could come from Frappato, which is the compact clusters. Now that's the kind of issue for Frappato in the vineyard. It's very tight clusters, right? So there are two biotypes, but they are both fairly tightly clustered. So again, you've got to make sure that it is dry, and it does better on drier soils, well-drained soils, calcareous soils, not well on clay-rich soils. It loses its aromatics, and you're going to smell it in a second and notice that this is an aromatic wine. That's what we're using it for. So those compact clusters and these small berries really are going to produce lovely wines. Now, these also have really high aromatics, floral, roses, violets, lavender, these terpenes also, strawberry, cinnamon. And then the second type, that's really in the first type. And the second type is a little smaller berries with lower acidity, but incredibly complex in aroma, spice, menthol, so many interesting things. Frappato is easy in the cellar. It is not a difficult grape. The only thing that it requires is that you constantly add oxygen, because it can get reductive, meaning it can really it can get kind of closed. It can get a little bit vinegary. So you don't want that. Instead, you want something that can allow it to express its aroma. So you keep pumping over. You do a lot of racking, meaning taking it from one barrel and putting it into the other. It's often blended with Nero d'Avola. It's often blended with Nerello Mascalese in the east. It's blended with a lot of things, Nocera, lots of different grapes. But Frappato typically, and we're going to taste it now, cherry and berry, dried herbs. It's just beautiful. It does tend to be lighter in color. Okay, so here's our color. If you don't have it, it's pretty light in color. It doesn't hold a lot of pigment, and it's not a very heavy wine. Okay, so swirl it around your glass. So I'm really getting a lot of that earth and spice. The menthol note is really lovely. Cherries. It is very exuberant, right? So taste. Yum, right? At least for me, it's a yum for me. Great acidity, mild tannin, spicy, floral. It's very exciting. Like, it's not a boring wine. And the more sips you take, the more it gets kind of developed, right? And it has, I'm seeing some licorice, spice. So where's the tannin? There isn't a whole lot of tannin in this grape. It is a much, much lower tannin grape. And so this is why it can take a chill. Remember that tannin, when you chill a wine, the tannin is going to be perceived as something that is higher. So you don't want that. You want something, you're going to chill wines that generally are lower in tannin. Beaujolais would be a good example. Grenache sometimes can be nice chilled. And something like this will be very nice chilled because the tannins are not very high. So you're not looking at a very tannic wine. And most of them are ready for early drinking too. So you can just buy them and drink them, which is also really nice. Cookie chilled her bottle first, getting more with each sip. Absolutely. That's the greatness of Frappato. It's one of these secret, very underrated wines, I would say. It's kind of it's one of these things that you can get your hands on and then say, oh my gosh, I need to drink more of this. So you have to remember that it's there, especially in warmer weather. What a great wine. I mean, it's a little dangerous because it does taste so good, but it goes so well with food that there's nothing, there's really no reason not to have it with cheese and to serve it, with a little chill in the summertime. So it's a great option for that. Let's finish out our history of Sicily, and then we will wrap up. We get to the bourbons, not the drink, as I say, Marsala, the drink, bourbons again, still not the drink. And then we'll talk about unification and we'll close out here. But the House of Bourbon started out French, had some Spanish influence, also had a Spanish branch, and that's who ran Sicily. So this was, the kings of Sicily. And then in 1773, just about 40 years after the House of Bourbon took over, an Englishman named John Woodhouse came to the west side of the island and decided that he really liked the base wine that was there, and thought if he fortified the wine for the journey back to England, where he was from, that it would be really good and it might be able to rival port, sherry, and Madeira, which were very popular at the time. And he did that. He set up a shop in Marsala and started his own Marsala house. So this is where Marsala was born. And Sicily does owe a big debt of gratitude to John Woodhouse because Marsala was their cash cow. This was their biggest wine for so long. It was so very popular. It was exported to the colonies. It was exported everywhere. It was a very esteemed wine. Today it's really, unfortunately, it's only very few who are keeping the craft of really high quality Marsala alive. And now everybody thinks of it as a cooking wine, as something that you make chicken, make a sauce out of it and put a chicken in it. But Marsala actually was quite a fine wine, still is. And it is aged in many different ways. They even have a Solera system for some of the different kinds. So it was very interesting. But the key thing about Marsala is that it put Sicily and Sicilian wines really on the map. And that was really important because England was a tastemaker. So if they liked Marsala, then you could be sure that would open the door for other wines from Sicily. And Marsala really helped the reputation. Unfortunately, there were some other events, right? So in the 1800s, things went very well for Sicily when phylloxera hit the rest of Europe. This was in the 1870s, and they were able to supply wine once again for areas that were completely devastated by phylloxera, much like Spain did. But when phylloxera hit Sicily, it did not go very well for them. They did not have the wherewithal, the money, or the interest to really get things going again. And part of that is because after Garibaldi, who's in our picture here, if you ever wondered what he looked like, he fought for unification of Italy. And after he came in and conquered Sicily and took over from the Bourbons, what happened is that Sicily did not adapt well to unification. And this is when we see things like poverty rising, organized crime rising, immigration. Once again, though, for the food culture of the world, what an unbelievable stroke of luck for the rest of the world, because Sicilians were not happy. They were not able to make a go of it. They did not feel like things were better under the unification of Italy. And so they moved here to the US, and they moved to the UK, and they moved to Australia, and they brought with them all of the traditions of food and wine. And that is how we get access to that, right? Is that first wave of immigration and every subsequent one after that, we benefit from that, right? So all of the little Italies and all of the Italian cuisines all around the world come from the fact that immigration happened. Some of it happened at this point, some of it happened after World Wars, but in any case, it dispersed this unbelievable culture, this wonderful culture of warmth, of love for food, of love for taking time with your wines and with your food and not rushing through life. So again, although things weren't great, and then after phylloxera, it took about 70 years for them to recover. Again, it happened at the worst time in the 1890s. Then you had World War I, you had the Depression, you had World War II. Sicily could not get ahead. And it wasn't really until the 1950s, after all the world wars were behind them, that they started making wine. But again, there was a lot of nationalism. People didn't want wine from outside of where they lived. They were trying to rebuild their own areas. So Sicily kind of suffered for that, but they did mechanize the vineyards. They did start once again selling some of that bulk wine, but then got a reputation for being a bulk wine producer. Standards slipped in Marsala. That also then sort of became a lesser product. So things in the 60s and the 70s were not great until these producers came and decided that they were going to take control over the situation, like Planeta, like Tasca del Marita, like Donofagata. And they decided, hey, we're going to plant some international varietals, get Sicily on the map. And they did. And then that opened the door for these indigenous varietals, because once they proved they could do one thing well, they proved that they could do everything else well. And that is where we are today, right? The investments, the idea that they could do this, that resolve, the idea that they can make it work, that the world is going to be interested in the indigenous products of Sicily. It's absolutely true. And today we have access to these because of, I think that idea, that culture, the excitement around the fact that, we have so much to offer, or so much to gain from Sicily. There are other wines that we did not try that I just want to go over very quickly, and then I'll take your questions. Insolia, again, I'm just showing you the labels because I think it's more important than showing you what the grapes look like. Insolia from Sicilia. That's going to be Ansonica, actually, in Tuscany, if you ever see that, but citrus, white flowers, ripe fruit, a little bit lower acidity. That's also a blending grape in Marsala, or was, and now it's a standalone. Caricante. Now, I'm sure that you thought, okay, well, Caricante is used in Etna Bianco, but it's also used in the Sicilia DOC, and it can be sparkling, which is really interesting. It can be still. It's kind of limey. It's got a lot of minerality, orange, a little bit of licorice note, actually, even, or anise. And it's often blended with Lucido, Caricante, and then Grecanico, which I've already told you is Garganiga, but that's got pineapple, pear, kind of some tropical fruits, a little bit fatter, little bitter almond note, real savory, delicious wine. And then all of the other, non-native grapes, Chardonnay, Viognier, Fiano, Pinot Grigio, Sauvignon Blanc, that's all here too. Red grapes, Nerello Mascalese, again, Sicilia DOC, not just for Etna Rosso, even though it is the main wine of Etna Rosso blended with Nerello Cappuccio, tends to be like earth and licorice and berries, minerals, really, really a lovely wine, a little bit lighter in style. It's very pretty. I always say it's kind of pretty, medium bodied. Nocera is in Mamertino, and this is in the Northeast. It's a little bit more tannic, higher alcohol, leather, spice, a little bit heavier. If you want something heavier, you can find a Nocera. And then Pericone, which is often blended with Nero, but now is also made as a standalone grape, high acidity, lots of red berries, earth, but that can also be very tannic. So all of these can be found, right? And then, of course, non-native grapes. There's Cab Sauv and Cabernet Franc, and Syrah is a really big grape here. But those native grapes are the ones I think to look out for in terms of the future of Sicily, which I think is incredibly bright. I think there's so much to offer. And, certainly if history has any indication of what's coming, things are only going to continue to be great for Sicily. You cannot discount the fact that they will take their raw materials, blend them in ways that you've never seen before, and make it work. That is the tradition. That is what Sicily does. And it's really quite exciting to see. So I hope that you learned something from these seminars. I hope you learned something from tonight and the one before that is on YouTube, like I said, and that you'll incorporate these wines into your kind of routine, your daily wine diet, I guess. and really just quite, they're quite delicious, and not to forget that they're out there because they're very unique. You're not going to find them anywhere else.
In terms of future, we have a really long future. In terms of being the market with all such a complexity, is something that needs time and to be done step by step. So what you mentioned is the geography of wine, that I think is the part of the wine that make it magic. That means that a wine can tell you and show you who he is and where he come from and how old is he. And that's great, is what we are trying to do. We have a really great treasure of diversity. So Sicily is a small island compared to their herd, but it's a big island and with a huge diversity, not only in terms of culture, but even in terms of landscape. So we have volcano, we have mountain, 65% of the viticulture is in the hills, and we have different kind of soils everywhere with calcareous, clay, sandy, volcanic soil, and each volcanic soil has different epochs, so different impact to the wines. We have more than 50 local native grape varieties, and in each place react in a different way. So there is a huge treasure of diversity, and the new techniques of marketing needed just short message. So it's really hard to keep all these once, just in one time in the market. So I think what we need to suggest is try to enjoy the treasure of Sicily and the treasure of Italy in general, and try to relax on the diversity and try to think and approach it as a treasure island. So going there and enjoy the journey.
Thank you to Sicilia DOC. And thank you to everybody for coming. I appreciate your time and just your interest and all your great comments. So if you are a patron, I will see you on the Zoom, the after party link. And otherwise, thank you all so much, and enjoy your wines, and make sure you have them with food, because that's the Sicilian tradition, right? Good night.